Hello, everyone. Great to be here at the Mint Budget Roundtable. At this session, we're going to be talking a little bit about technology. Now, it's no secret to any of you that digital technology, these are the areas that have been very much a central part of the India story all the way from Y2K to now. It's been really led by and large by the software industry and by the IT services industry. Increasingly, a lot of talk taking place around hardware as well. India ranks third among the most attractive investment destinations for technology transactions in the world. And we've seen a considerable transformation when it comes to digital infrastructure, including a lot of things that have been done at the grassroots levels, like digital payments. But what should be done now? How do we continue to build on this? What technology policies are really required to make sure that India can dominate and continue to dominate, and perhaps not just in software, but also in hardware. We have a fantastic panel joining us to talk us through various aspects of that. Let me start off by welcoming Abhishek Isar, who's the founder, Reach and Advocacy Initiative. He's also founding member of the Federation of the Electronic Sports Association of India. It's great to have you with us. Rohit Kumar, founder and CEO of ZSoftPoint. Up next, he's done a lot of work around website and app development, SEO, software development, you name it. Rohit's been working in all those areas. Smita Purushottam, well, she's former ambassador to Switzerland, has represented India in a large number of places, but is also the founder of Sitara, which is doing some absolutely fantastic work in how do you take a digital forward in all sorts of areas. Rajneesh Kumar, SVP and Chief Corporate Officer of Corporate Affairs Officer, Flipkart, is also with us. And last but not by no means not the least, Dr. Pawan Duggal, who's probably the number one person you need to go to if you're having any issues around cybercrime or cybersecurity or cyber safety or anything to do with cyber issues. Dr. Duggal is the person you should be reaching out to. Thank you all so much for joining us. Let me just start off by first throwing that basic premise, which I started by roughly referring to. When you talk about India and you talk about technology and you talk about the Indian technology sector, till now it's largely been software, right? That many of us have spoken about, IT services. Is this the year and is this the period where you think a significant dent can be made to say, no, we want to be a player in hardware as well. We want to get semiconductors inside. We want to get fabs inside. And that's really the area that we want to grow in. Who wants to take that first? Abhishek, should I throw that to you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Vikram, for having to lend a wonderful introduction and having to sort of lead the perfect sort of foundation to this wonderful session. Warm greetings to everybody, all those on the panel and those sort of listening to us. It's a very micro sort of a overview that you sort of sought a response from each one of us. So I'll try and maybe limit myself to aspects that I have intentionally sort of positioned to kind of speak at this very forum. Definitely, I think this year, moving onwards to a 3 to 4 year sort of a horizon, will assure and promise a good runway for India to kind of establish itself very strongly on the technology front. I think one way to kind of look at it is that there are 2-3 sort of touch points everybody refers to with respect to India every now and then, which is our internet penetration. And of course, pandemic-induced sort of lockdown has kind of put India at a certain premise at a global perspective. There's a good sense why our consumer market is, of course, a sought after one, especially on the digital arena globally. Explains well why we've seen the emergence of about multiple, in fact, 40 plus unicorns in the last year and a half sort of gone by. In fact, I was listening to a different forum where I think one of the important elements that we have to also understand and study is that the growth potential with respect to India definitely comes from the fact that not only do we have a strong consumer base, but I think from a policy perspective, the government has taken certain strategic but very keen sort of steps to mobilize the larger sort of industry to be involved and collaborate to kind of invite not just foreign investments coming to the country, but also evangelize young minds in the country to address some of the most elementary sort of concerns, whether it's in the healthcare space, whether it's logistics. I can definitely vouch for gaming industry, very specifically esports, which is a smaller subsegment of the larger gaming umbrella, but definitely an emerging market, not just with respect to the India story, but even globally. I think as we sort of move along, I'll definitely lend more insights with respect to this particular segment. But net, to summarize an answer, yes, I think now is the best time for India to kind of, not just the industry Inc., but also policymakers to come together, collaborate, and shape out India's bright future.
Right. Smita Purushottam, before I come to some of the other aspects of the tech story, if you just look at the possibility for domestic high-tech production, which may well be one of the things you're going to hear something about in the budget, Sitara has been doing a lot of work in, how do you indigenize, how do you get high-tech production, what should be done to build a science nation really in India. What would be some of your thoughts of what can be done, what should be done, and what perhaps you might want to hear a little bit about in the budget?
Okay. Thank you very much for involving me in this very eminent panel. And I'm especially happy to meet you, Sri Chandra. I've always admired the way you have, conducted the sessions on TV channels and the moderate and very reasoned, balanced way in which you conduct. So I'm really privileged to be here. Yes, thank you. Welcome. So basically, I think we've come a long way in the last 2-3 years. Sitara started by focusing on procurement reforms because we found that in major economies like China and the US, it was procurement by government which was the key to kickstart their high-tech sectors. And we have achieved so much there. The nation has achieved so much. The biggest victory, of course, was to alert the government about the threat of Chinese dominance of our ICT networks, which constituted a huge national security danger. And it was Sitara really which focused on China's information warfare strategy, brought this to the attention of the National Security Council Secretariat. And then this security consciousness was, assimilated in government, and a lot of reforms have taken place after that. So let us recognize and celebrate this achievement. At the same time, we feel that there's a long way to go. PLI and other incentives have done a lot to start the process of hardware manufacture in India, but still we're at a very low value addition stage. Sitara has some very, very focused suggestions to give on this. So should I give it now or should I do it in the course of the discussion?
Right, sure. I mean, if you have concrete suggestions, now's the time.
Okay, so basically we see number of schemes, specs, the fund of funds, and so many schemes being rolled out by MeitY and other departments, and some procurement reforms also, but they are very agnostic. They're not targeted. For example, the Americans, China always have a vision. They have a vision. This is a security threat, and this is what we need to build up a high-tech national security capabilities. And ICT, of course, is at the core of their strategies, especially the Chinese. So what we need to do is to focus on, say, 5G or some such technology, and then come up with a package in which we support concretely some companies, a few companies for each component, so that we build the domestic ecosystem. Unless we have that strategy, every scheme is set up basically to fail, because ultimately we'll be left with very low value addition in the country. And already there's a growing demand for introducing for lowering tariffs even for the PLI scheme. Now we only have 10 to 20% value addition, and if we lower tariffs further, what will be left to be done in India? So let us give ourselves a little time to promote this, but not too much time, because there's a lot of pressure to open up the economy. So let us come up with a vision, identify the components, identify the ecosystem that we wish to create, and then go ahead. And lastly, I just want to mention that there's a smart city project the Swiss are pursuing. In case they succeed, then we create the congenial surroundings for investments, for brains, for NRIs to return, for people to live a very first world kind of life in India, because a lot of our problems are basically due to our engineers fleeing abroad. The CSET report states that more than half of all semiconductor engineers in America are of Indian origin. We can
Yeah.
retain that talent, we can share it also, but we can retain it. But those people go there for considerations other than, just income. It's the quality of life, it's recognition. If we can create those conditions in India, and it has to be a whole of government approach. I mean, smart cities is done by urban development and ICT by several ministries. I think the Prime Minister's office should lead it and take this to conclusion. Thank you.
I think, Svinaji, that's such an interesting point. I'm going to come back to it because you're right. There are so many Indians setting up, being CEOs of global companies. They're setting up startups abroad. What can be done to encourage them to do it right here? I think that's a really important point. And you're correct that money and the rest of it is only part of it. You've got to make sure that you're giving them the ability to. You said first world conditions. It's certainly something that should be considered. How do you create the infrastructure? How do you create the environment for people to be incentivized to grow and build their companies right out here? I'm going to return to that point. I'm going to get everyone's views on that. But if I could just quickly shift to Rohit Kumar, the founder and CEO of ZSoftPoint. We're talking about hardware to some extent, some of the things that should be done. But one of the issues, I guess, is when if it comes to India trying to break into global supply chains and things like semiconductors, it's a challenge. But increasingly, even software, the cloud, the services, data center services, a lot of this there's a view that it's being increasingly monopolized. I mean, monopoly is not a good word, but big tech is really playing a more and more important role. And it's very tough for anybody else to break into it. That at least is the perception. Would you agree with that? And what can companies in India, or what can India as a country really do to try and fit into this an area where there are a certain number of companies that seem to be dominating a lot?
Thank you for having me here. I remember I was in India Europe Business Forum in 2019, and we have 29 European country and along with India. Then we had a target with India Europe combined 10 trillion economy, and we achieved. In terms of monopoly of cloud and other services of other giant companies, including China, we did lots of things after pandemic. We did partnership with AWS, and we launched AWS data center in Mumbai, which is already running. And there is another AWS data center is going to run in mid of 2022. And we did lots of things in terms of cloud security, cyber security, because after pandemic, every individual or SMEs or MSMEs have adopted cloud services in any manner. Either they have adopted cloud services for their offices or for documentation or for Zoom meetings. But there is a security concern for all these. And we are also working on that, and we are doing very great. I cannot say that there is a monopoly of Chinese and any other countries for that, but we are also doing very great on that platform.
Okay, Rajneesh, if I could turn to you next, how do you see the overall landscape? Where does India fit into these global supply chains? Which are the specific areas and niches where you think India could say, look, this is our territory and we can really make a major play here?
Vikram, first of all, really appreciate you bringing all these exalted panel and together on this important issue. I think when I look at, especially when you look at the current ongoing sort of healthcare situation and how it has disrupted the supply chain, I think it becomes important to look at it from the perspective that while supply chain will remain decentralized, right? When you look at the global supply chain today, part of the things are getting manufactured at different places. So I think the reality is that this is remains a global supply chain. But I think important point is to look at how do you make sure it is safe and secured, because when you look at the supply chain in pandemic, especially on electronic side and manufacturing side, and there was a need for obviously a lot of smartphones, iPads, and a lot of other devices. Uh, there was a significant challenge that all of us saw from a supply side perspective. Uh, but as we grow, obviously the government has done several schemes in PLI and many other parts to this. But I think the key to that is not just looking at supporting local innovations and supporting them and building these right policies from a enabling framework perspective for manufacturing industry, but also the key is to make sure that we do a lot of those important trade agreement with countries which are important, and I think that will play an important role, because uh, decentralized supply chain plus a sort of a growing and developing local manufacturing will be the key integrated component for this one. And I think that's where I think we need to be mindful that we can't be in this world, we can't be self-sufficient on that. We need to make sure that we build strategic partnerships and make sure that we protect our interest as we go forward in an area which will be mostly driven by from a technology perspective. I mean, a small answer, but I think happy to elaborate as we go forward. But I think the key is to sort of make sure that we have a very balanced approach on those fronts.
Right. I think it'd be good to get everyone sort of opening comments and figure out where we are, and then we can take some of these themes forward. But Pavindukar, if I could come to you, when you're talking about a policy framework, one of the most important things, I guess, that has to be done, and this has to be done at the government level, is to make sure the laws are in place, the rules are in place, the cyber security is in place. If you want people to have trust and faith in the system, you want to make sure that scammers and phishers and others aren't taking advantage of it. How evolved are our systems by now? Have they done most of the things that you would have liked them to have done? Are there still important gaps that are missing?
Well, thanks, Vikram, for your kind words. First and foremost, I see this entire process as work in progress. India has done some bit, but it's yet to do a lot of homework in terms of addressing the huge gaps that are existing in the digital ecosystem. Well, we are slowly now coming out of COVID 19, but COVID 19 has had an irreversible impact upon our lives. In my latest book, New Cyber World Order Post COVID 19, I've argued that by the time nations are victorious against the current wave of COVID 19 infections, we will enter into a new cyber age where a new cyber world order would be awaiting us. And one of the key parameters of this new cyber world order would be increasing cyber crimes, and cybersecurity breaches will be the new default normal. No wonder with the coming of COVID 19, the golden age of cybercrime has already arrived. But when I look at India's preparedness or its approach on policy making and lawmaking, I find that we are still pretty much seeped in the past. We are just still relying upon our mother legislation on information technology, being the Information Technology Act, that we enacted 22 years back in the year 2000, which we only amended once in 2008. Since then, technology has moved massively forward, but we haven't really gone ahead and amended the law. Yes, we have been coming up with rules and regulations under the IT Act, including the IT Rules 2021, which were a kind of a watershed moment in the evolution of cyber legal jurisprudence, because they've gone ahead and for the first time invoked the criminal liability of intermediaries and service providers. But having said that, the focus is not more on amending the IT Act, it's been more focused on protecting the data. And that's why the Personal Data Protection Bill 2019, which was tabled in December 19, is now in for a new avatar. Why? Because the Joint Parliamentary Committee's report of December 2021 has actually suggested various new amendments to the same. So we should be seeing a new law on data protection, but I think we are still broadly missing the big elephant in the room, and that elephant is cybersecurity regulation. We are now, till today, as a nation, not having a dedicated law on cybersecurity. And the existing legal frameworks under the IT Act are not at all adequate. Even our national cybersecurity policy of 2013 has not been really very much implemented and has remained a paper tiger. Yes, we are now coming up with a new national cybersecurity strategy in 2022. But I think along with the strategy, when I see countries like China, Vietnam, Singapore, and Australia moving miles ahead in coming up with dedicated national laws on cybersecurity, I see that India must immediately come up with new legal frameworks on cybersecurity. Further, newly emerging technologies are crying very hard that at least give us some enabling legal frameworks. But unfortunately, we haven't done much in terms of even thinking our policy on regulating artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and blockchains. Yes, the government is now talking of a new cryptocurrency bill, but we are not very sure what aspects of the cryptocurrency it's going to potentially be looking at. The time has come where we need more enablement of smart contracts, of the crypto ecosystem, of giving the satisfaction to every digital stakeholder that your data, your networks in India are safe, secure, and reliable. But for that, a lot of political will is required, and the focus will have to come back on the government on how it wants to go ahead and come up with legislative frameworks and legal rules, policies, and regulations in this regard.
Right, Dr. Lokal. In fact, that sets the stage for the next round. I'm going to come to everyone with. You're absolutely correct in saying, technology changes, and the things that you're trying to regulate is going to be very different every year, every 2 years. And with technology continuing to go exponential, you're going to probably have to go faster and faster and faster. Before you know it, the metaverse is going to be here. Before you know it, genomic editing will take on a new role. Before you know it, something else is going to happen. And we've got to be prepared to keep on moving faster and faster and have very, very nimble regulation and legislation. I think that's one of the first things that we should perhaps emerge from this with. In fact, Abhishek, if I could turn to you on that, take one of the areas that you've been in, for example, gaming. Now, suddenly we were just about getting the hang of, okay, what is gaming? Then we said, okay, there's electronic gaming versus physical gaming. Then we were having this entire debate about the difference between game of chance and game of skill, and how should that be regulated. And by the time we sort this out, before you know it, there will be virtual worlds where you're gaming in a metaverse, and now you're suddenly scratching your head and saying, what do we do with this? So if you could help us perhaps, for any policymakers watching this, what should they be keeping in mind in sectors like this? And gaming is huge, right? It's probably as big as into the entertainment industry and maybe films and music put together.
Well, you pretty much nailed it, Vikram. And again, thank you for articulating the flow of this conversation in a very strategic manner, which you're always good at. I'd also, of course, appreciate what Dr. Pawan Dugal highlighted. I think the operative expression here is work in progress. There are multiple conversations to be taken care of. If I were to just contextualize this by way of gaming per se, I think, Vikram, you highlighted that very well. The gaming is a meta universe by itself, and within that, there are at least 3 to 4 different segments. It so happens that we refer to how gaming has sort of scaled up, in a country like India. To kind of add some perspective, I think in total about 430 odd million mobile gamers in this country. The big revolution that India is taking forward to the world is that, unlike traditional gaming markets, which were based on PC and console, India will always remain a mobile-first economy. And I think that's kind of usurped the interest of the global sort of investors coming here. The interesting element here also is, which is worthy for us to take note of, that India, by way of share volume, is definitely big, but by way of, let's say, competitive gaming globally, is by far not even in the top sort of 20 sort of competing nations, if I were to put it like that. So for us, it's very important to understand, and therefore the genesis of this Federation of Electronic Esports Associations for the country. When we sort of looked at the gaming ecosystem as far as India is concerned back in 2019 and 2020, we realized that by way of policy, we are a long way off from trying to understand exactly what this industry is all about. There was a fair amount of fund infusion in a bunch of companies, but largely it was, if I were to simplify it, non-esports, right? You laid a comment, and I think we've seen a lot, both by way of policymakers and the media, talking about game of skills versus game of chance. To simplify this, I think if there was a pure description of a game of skill, it would largely fall under the ambit of electronic sports, what we call as esports globally. And I think that's a direction, at least one attempted with a bunch of some extremely respectable individuals. And I may take the liberty of referring to a couple of them. Part of this federation is very well-known Olympian, Mr. Gagan Narang. Gagan has, of course, been instrumental in not just bringing knowledge to the country, but also administratively. He's been very forthcoming in trying to structure and create the right contours of what would fall under the ambit of electronic sports. So, and then, of course, there's Baichung Bhutia, who's also advising Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports.
But if I could just ask you, if there would be any specific sort of regulatory, we are frankly saying what is it the government can do in the budget or just
Correct.
after that, right? What would you like to hear, sort of a thing? So what could they do to try and bring some, what could the government do? How do you differentiate between chance and skill, for example?
Very critical. I think a bunch of things need to be addressed all at the same time. Data protection is one very important element, which falls under the larger data sovereignty dialogue and perspective. Currently, the format of games is as such that Indians end up playing games which are produced and manufactured internationally. So, and there is a very strong case of, our data, hours spent by all these users, and I've mentioned about 430 odd million gamers in the country, is largely also seeping out of this country. There is a definitive cause that the government should take cognizance of this. I'd also like to highlight that the government of Karnataka, as of yesterday, has formalized a center of excellence for AVGC. I think AVGC is a very important and an imperative stand that the government must need to look at, Ministry of I&B, which is to be able to address that, gaming should not just be looked at from the prism of entertainment. Specifically, esports, electronic sports should be looked at from the prism of education as well. Because the same bunch of players tomorrow, if educated well by way of primary education system and secondary education system, would be the coders of tomorrow, right? And would be able to sort of contribute in industries beyond the gaming industry per se.
Besides the day you can actually gamify things like learning mathematics, you'll probably get far better results. Right? There's nothing quite like making a game out of everything. Rajesh, I'm going to turn to you, looking at policies and looking at, again, what the government could be doing in the budget. Sectors like e-commerce, been around for a while, you would think that the rules and the regulations and the framework is in place, but new things are happening constantly. Before you know it, as the metaverse comes, you'll be sitting and trying out things in real, trying out clothes in real time in some form or the other. What do you think are some of the pain points and areas which you think policy should be looking at right now?
Vikram, if I look at purely from an e-commerce perspective, I think we are obviously in a very early stage of the game. E-commerce is of $850 billion retail. E-commerce is merely 4 to 5 or maybe 6% of the overall retail market. It's very early in the game. I think
it's interesting to hear you saying that, because a lot of people feel that e-commerce has already taken over everything. You're saying it's still the early stages of the game, so there's still a lot of evolution.
Absolutely. If you look at the product e-commerce, absolutely. If you look at the product e-commerce, the space of retail is around $850 billion, and e-commerce is like 5 to 6. Maybe in pandemic it has gone a little bit, but it is not more than 5.5% right now. We obviously sitting in Delhi, Mumbai, and metros obviously see the massive impact of it. But having said that, I think what is really happening from e-commerce perspective, both on the supply side and on the customer side, there is an increasing propensity to go online. And, so for example, in last 7-8 months, or slightly more than that, since pandemic actually started, you have seen 70% of the people who come online are actually coming from tier 2 and tier 3 from a seller perspective. So which means there is an increasing trend when MSMEs see the possibilities of accessing a pan-India market. There is an enormous possibilities which online offers to them. I think that's where there are issues where we expect government to do more on enabling or making it easy for MSMEs to go online, because today the compliance burden on small businesses, particularly if they want to come online, is huge. And one of my expectation is obviously that government will do make it slightly easier, reduce the compliance burden on smaller businesses to get online. I think that's one. Similarly, there are on taxation, the sellers who come online, particularly the smaller ones, which are the ones which face a lot of challenges. They have to deposit a TCS of 1% additional, and this is a huge compliance burden on them. So I think the suggestion has been that can we make it easy for them, because the transformation which businesses, particularly smaller ones, will see when they go online, I think the whole economy will sort of will see the dramatic transformation, including the rural side. And If I can add one more initial point, bringing e-commerce to people in their vernacular language has also dramatically changed the possibilities which it brings to the smaller consumers across the country, which means the sellers will have a wider market. And I think that's our effort as we expand the consumer internet ecosystem. We want to make sure that it is available in vernacular language. But I think the expectation from the government is that there is a lesser compliance, particularly on the smaller businesses, and obviously a soft touch regulation, because one of the challenge which I think, and you were talking to Mr. Isser about this one, I think a lot of time industry also need to be slightly more proactive in engaging with the policymakers, because policy will always lag behind in these areas. So if we can frame the construct well, engage constantly with the policymakers and the broader ecosystem, then I think the evolution of technology policy will possibly be a lot more effective, and the lag won't be so much.
Okay, those are really interesting points, and reduce the compliance burden and make sure it is soft touch. Those are interesting points to touch on. Rohit, anything you'd like to add to that? And again, you've been doing a lot of work in some of the new sunrise areas like Internet of Things and other things. What would be some of the specific policies that you would be looking for? Rohit?
Yes. Hello.
Yeah, I was just saying that what would be some of the specific, if you are a finance minister, what would you say in the budget speech to make sure that this entire technology sector leapfrogs, faster and faster?
Yes, I am completely agree with Pawan sir, who added that we need some cybersecurity reforms and laws so that we can protect our data well, because everyone is going online, everyone is adopting cloud services. But I want to add something in that. We also need to build the infrastructure for our data security. We need to support some startups so that they can build the infrastructure for cloud and cyber security, so that our data should be in our country. There is a main thing to protect our data. Suppose anyone is using AWS, then there is a chances before 2015, there is a chances that your data should be outside the India. But in the current scenario, there is a possibility that your data should be in India. Hello? Yeah.
Yeah.
And at this stage, we have already working on that, and we are installing a new server in Hyderabad. I also add some points that there is a gap between startups and corporates to collaborate in these kind of fields. So we need to reduce that gap and also reduce the technology policy and the compliances. As
All right.
Rajni sir said that there are lots of compliances for SMEs and MSMEs to go online to start selling for e-commerce. So we need to reduce all these compliances, and we need to make ease of doing business very simpler.
Okay. Again, the same themes are coming up: compliance, ease of doing business. Pawan, let me throw that to you, Dr. Duggar. There is obviously a slight dichotomy between saying, look, we have to have tight compliance, we have to have tough laws to stamp down on the bad guys, right? They're malicious players, they're fraudsters, they're fishers out there in the market, and we've got to make sure that they aren't there. And that has to be set aside the other objective, which is what we were just hearing from both Rajesh and from Rohit: have a light touch regulation, have ease of doing business, have easier compliance. And somewhere along the way, there is a right balance that has to be done between the two. You don't necessarily have to think that everybody coming on online is a fraudster. And sometimes if you get too tough, there was a lot of backlash that happened about some of these new rules that were coming up from the RBI, for example, about automatic deduction and can you save credit cards or not. So sometimes there are policies that are aimed at the really bad guys, which can become a headache for everybody else. Is that a problem that you see, and how do you get the right balance in? And luckily, the RBI listened to your advice and said, we'll give you some more time to do it. We're not going to hurry. But what advice would you give the government at this stage?
Well, I would want to tell the government, let's not be adventurous. Let's go step by step. Right now, technology is only requiring very minimal enabling regulation. To say that technology won't require any regulation would be a misnomer. Yes, minimal regulation is the need of the hour. Why? Because this minimal regulatory environment is required by the industry in order to grow to its full potential. Yes, any kind of adventuristic approach in terms of very, very broad laws which could have a detrimental impact on business should be a complete no-no. In fact, the guiding light for the government has to be how can we go ahead and propagate the growth of not just e-business, but also the digital ecosystem and now the metaverse ecosystem as it's coming across. Well, the government has been doing its work. It's come up with the Startup India program. It's coming up with the Kaushal India program. So a lot of new programs are in place. But what they ultimately still require is some enabling regulation. Now, for example, lately we have been seeing that there's been some kind of advisories that have been launched, but expecting advisories to be followed by Indians in letter and spirit is definitely not the right way. Primarily because maybe it's a mindset issue. Maybe in India, people prefer to keep on delaying complying with the expected norms till such time there's a penal consequence or there's some kind of a force of law. So to that extent, there has to be certain kind of consequences for people who abuse technology, who go and target others, who breach the cybersecurity of systems, networks, and data. But beyond that, I think it has to be let the industry grow to its full potential. Whatever support the industry wants, let's give it to them. Let's not look at that we are a centralized state where we are trying to get as much power in the hands of the state. No, we are here ultimately realizing the fundamental issue that if the technology flourishes, if the economy flourishes, the country flourishes. And the law and regulation only has to have a light touch approach, a minimal enabling approach. However, what will be the final golden balance that the government will actually weigh in will depend upon what will be the immediate priorities of the government this year and in the coming times.
Right, Smitaji, if I could just turn to you and I come back a little bit once again to some of the hardware thrusts that the government is doing. Look, we've had PLI and other things, and yes, it's certainly true that this is the right moment. You do have a situation where there's been chip shortages. You do have a situation where many people are feeling we want to diversify away from China, so it's the right moment. But so far, if you look at the reality on the ground, India's what? 2% of global electronic manufacturers, maybe 0.2% of electronic exports. So clearly there's a lot that we can do. If you were finance minister, what would you say in this budget? Is there some specific things that you think could be announced or put forward to make sure we can leapfrog here?
Thank you again. Well, yes, in fact, we have already given these suggestions to our government. And sorry for that little glitch, the power went off here. So basically, Section 35 2AB has been diluted greatly, which gives R&D incentives. Now, as several speakers and yourself mentioned earlier, R&D is the driving force in an economy. We have 100 schemes, very few focusing on the core issue of R&D. When you look at the income and standard of living differentials between India and developed countries, it's mainly the R&D intensity of the economies which stands out, which makes the difference. And Robert Solow, the Nobel Prize winning economist, has actually calculated that the greatest contribution to economic growth is by R&D. 90% it contributes to growth. And that is one thing which is not central to our economic policy. So I would request the finance minister to please put R&D at the center stage of all national development strategy. Now, having said that, a few things, as I said, restore the tax incentives. For example, in telecom and other ICT procurement, which procurement is the key here. Again, here, if we could make procurement the basis of our growth strategy, because $500 billion of government procurement all over India is expended every year, and most of it we found is going to foreign companies. So India is gifting this huge amount to developed economies elsewhere when we have the capabilities here. Now, if we make procurement again our central strategy, then we give IPR ownership by Indian companies greater weightage in our procurement policies. And also we give tax incentives to telecom operators and other procurement agencies, L&T, etc., to buy Indian equipment. that also ties in with the issue of cybersecurity that Sri Pawan Dugal mentioned. And I would like to add that we should also look at hardware cybersecurity. And here, if I may mention, Sitara had approached the National Security Council Secretariat with a suggestion to have a Telecom Security Act along the lines of the US, China also, Australia, New Zealand, and perhaps a few other countries. And under this legislation, have make it imperative that the telecom products that you induct in your ecosystem are certified as blemish free and leakage proof, because we know that exfiltration, cyber attacks, etc., don't come just from China, they come from other sources as well. Instead, what we have is campaigns to induct foreign equipment into our core networks. So here is one area that the finance minister could tackle in her budget, and embed cybersecurity really in procurement, in procurement itself. These are some of the issues. And if I may just go back to the issue of big tech, we have big tech being awarded number of contracts by one government agency, for example, and then the courts and the Competition Commission of India then levy penalties on them. So there's no whole of government approach to national security, to data security, to data privacy. We would request that hardware security be looked at and a holistic approach be taken, so that one government agency doesn't award a whole lot of contracts to AWS, to Oracle. In fact, they are allowed access to the most sensitive data which is held by government on its citizens, on its operations in the aspirational districts and so on. And on the other hand, the Competition Commission of India, etc., are going after them. So there has to be some consistency in approach there. I hope that answers.
All right. All right. That's. I want to just come back to one of the other things that you had spoken about a little earlier, which was making sure you're talking about not gifting a lot of things abroad if when it comes to trained talent. How do you retain India's brightest and best? How do you get all these global CEOs to be saying we're running companies in India? How do you get startups to be set up in India instead of being sent them abroad? And that's where you, ma'am, was saying that it's important that the ease of living, in a sense, has to match ease of doing business, and both have to go together. Any thoughts that any of you, the others on the panel, have on that particular theme? Pawan, would you like to say something on that? How do you make sure that everyone's incentivized? Set up your business here in India, run your businesses from here. Don't feel you have to go to Singapore or Silicon Valley or some other place to do high tech.
I think for that, we require a change of mindset. Right now, there is so much of
mindset at whose level? The government's level, our level, society's level?
Well, it has to be first at the level of the government, then at the level of the stakeholders. Today, there's a huge kind of hesitancy, primarily because setting up any kind of a unit or a production house in India could potentially be opening up a Pandora's box of headaches. So we need to have a one window approach. We need to have enabling. We also need to give enabling incentives. Let's give them a tax holiday for at least 5-7 years. No problem. If India as a nation is investing this back in the economy, I think that's ultimately going to pay rich dividends tomorrow. And of course, clearly, the level of living in the country needs to be appropriately supported. Right now, COVID has put a lot of Indians back into the poverty line. It's time that we'll have to come up with more innovative schemes so that we can encourage more talent. Right now, the problem is everybody who's in the middle class or above who wants their children to go out because they know, well, there's no future here in India. Because even if you want to set up a business, it's going to take you years, maybe decades to get started. And every now it'll be the license Raj, it'll be the normal inspector wala, or it'll be the municipal wala who's going to come and trouble you. Now that kind of inspector, municipal Raj mindset needs to be given away. Well, this government has done a lot in terms of getting more transparency and accountability, but I think we need to go beyond. We need to create concrete parameters. And I think if you give economic concessions, incentives, that could be great starting points. It should not only be limited to the TBIs of the world. It should be just available to anyone. And now that we are actually promoting very actively the startup ecosystem, they need to be substantially subsidized. They need to be given all kinds of financial incentives, advantages, because if any startups, well, we have 40 of them which are unicorns, we want more unicorns, maybe 500 unicorns. But for that, the law framework needs to change. The mindset needs to be changed. It should be an approach that it's the bureaucracy should not be a stumbling block in the growth going forward. And for that, the direct benefits have to reach up to the direct stakeholders who want to contribute in making India big, in making Indian digital economy big. So financial
All right.
incentives, financial encouragements should be the great starting point.
Right, Abhishek, let me get you in before I come to the others on that. Now, of course, financial incentives and financial, that there's a bill for that. And I know the finance minister and others say we can't afford everything, right? There are other priorities. A lot of poor people have become much poorer at a time like this. Our focus has to be there. Our focus should be on a social security net of some sort for the poorest of the poor, and that is correct. So we all understand the compulsions that a finance minister will be under. Some of the other things, though, that both Smitaji and Pawan were talking about, perhaps are easier to do, which is just, ease of doing business, making sure that it's a more comfortable environment. Is that something which you think would help a lot of the younger people to say, I mean, what Pawan said was almost disturbing. A lot of people are saying, well, go abroad because you don't have much of a future out here. That's something which is also possible to change that attitude without necessarily having to give a lot of money for it. It's just a question of changing some aspects about ease of living as much as ease of doing business.
Right. And I think Dr. Duggal also highlighted very critically that first the policymakers need to sort of adapt and adopt that approach, which will then eventually trickle down to the industries and then eventually sort of decentralize it. What's the concept of a metaverse today, or cryptocurrency, if I were to put it like that, is to be able to decentralize ownership, right? And I think, my previous comment was actually on Karnataka having to launch a Center of Excellence, AVGC. Now, Karnataka as a state has had an AVGC policy for close to about 6-8 years. To refurbish it again and put it out is a good move. Is that enough, though, is the question. And I feel that each of the states and territories within this country can be incentivized to actually focus themselves to this very segment. And let's be fair and honest. At a high level, the Honorable Prime Minister addressing the toy manufacturers industry, both last year and the year before that, has delved on the fact that the importance of gaming is staring upon us. It's important, though, that we promote an indigenous narrative. Now, that I think by itself is a good endorsement of what can possibly happen with respect to a policy outlook when we're referring to an ABGC. But what we need to do is to get threadbare into making this accessible, not just to international investors. I'll give you a quick example. There's a very well-known international entity called Unreal Engine. It is possibly and arguably one of the, it holds the largest market share with having to have developed some of the world's best games. Now, they're engaging with the country in various manners, not just limited to gaming. They're actually advising ISRO as well, just to kind of sort of cover a spectrum. They're very keen to kind of build, support with India's national education policy, which has already highlighted that gaming should be part of it. Now, that announcement happened a couple of years back. We haven't done much. A center of excellence, which is regionally segregated and as an empowering tool, should essentially be, one such means that will give access to people locally to kind of align themselves with. And let's be honest, we actually have this infrastructure with us, each one of us. And this is what's making India where it's reached. We just need to kind of empower toolkits or knowledge to the end consumer via this mobile handset, whether it's through a gaming platform and so on and so forth, but to have them engage on the knowledge end, which is why I said one such objective of this body that we've done is to make sure education remains a pivotal aspect. And we're encouraging Indian stakeholders. Last point, Vikram, if you don't mind, I like to make is that the segregation of, let's say, just within the online gaming space, for an esports, it's important. Sports is a state subject, will always remain at the behest of some state leaders. The government has to take a clear stand on suggesting, this falls under the entertainment tax. And let's say electronic sports should fall ideally under the sports ambit, therefore reducing the tax burden as well. Those are some of my views.
All right, Rajesh, any final thoughts? There's one sort of a overall thing that perhaps we can leave people watching this with. And it's an interesting point that arises partly from what Abhishek said, that in many ways, technology and digital technology in particular has become an enormously empowering, it's something which is creating a lot of empowerment at the grassroots. Because as you correctly said, you've got a mobile phone in your hand. That mobile phone is there in the hands of a vast majority of Indians right now, and they can use that, therefore, to do things that are much tougher to do. Not everyone can come and work in a fab factory or in a chip factory or in something else, but some of the things that you can do and the ways that transformation can happen using digital means and using your mobile phone are actually pretty massive. that presumably is one of the reasons why this has to continue to be a major thrust area for the government. Technology, digital in specifically, and technology in general.
No, I absolutely agree to what Abhishek and Smitaji and what you're saying. I think we would not have seen this growth that we are seeing on e-commerce, for example. It is not just because of the not just pandemic induced, but also because today this phone is available to people, including in hinterland. And some of the examples that we have seen for smaller sellers who have become so empowered that from a very tiny localized business to pan India, and some of them are also becoming part of global supply chain. I think the impact which technology can bring it is absolutely outstanding. That in terms of what it can deliver on ground, at the grassroots level. So I completely agree with some of the stuff that you mentioned, and really endorsing what Abhishek and Smitaji have talked about. And also, so for me, primarily, I think the key, if we can enable more on the digital transformation at the grassroots level, whether it is through reducing the compliance burden at the small players, or enabling a sort of a society light touch regulation, I think tremendous amount of things will change. And obviously, a greater focus on R&D, and I think local innovations, which I think is, if we are able to bring the right policies to make these changes and make this emphasize on these aspects in budget, I think it will be a tremendous outcome that we will see.
All right, one last word perhaps from you, Rohit, and let's just end with something which actually the Prime Minister has now put before the entire global community at Davos. What are we going to do about cryptocurrency? Ban it, regulate it, control it, recognize that it can't be regulated. What happens with cryptocurrency? And that may be one of the big headaches that everyone in the government is scratching their heads over. Maybe one line from each of you on that, and then we can end this session. Rohit, you first. Cryptocurrency, what should be done, if anything?
Every country is adopting cryptocurrency right now, but there is no central regulatory for the cryptocurrency.
Not every country. There are countries who are saying we're going to ban it. We're going to ban buying.
Yeah, lots of countries are thinking, and lots of countries had adopted cryptocurrency. But there is a risk that there is no any central authority to monitor that.
That by definition, that's the whole point of cryptocurrency, is not to have a central authority.
Yeah, so we need to focus on that there is a huge risk to adopting cryptocurrency in India. Lots of people are using cryptocurrency, but government is suggesting that there is no central authority as of right now. So we need to think of that.
Okay.
Because investing in cryptocurrency is not secure. We can say that.
Okay, yeah, I guess lots of questions and which will continue around that. Pavan, or anybody else, you want to have a quick final word? Anybody wants to throw in on cryptocurrency?
Well, I can just say one thing. Cryptocurrency is the present and the future. So I understand the hesitancy of the governments, but let's begin by taking small baby steps. And the baby steps can be, let's start treating cryptocurrencies as crypto assets rather than currencies per se. Let's come up with minimal enabling frameworks. Let's learn from the wisdoms of countries like Malta and Belarus and also Estonia in terms of having done some remarkable work. You can't take an ostrich approach and think at mid-noon that you're closing your eyes and it's midnight. Sorry. Cryptocurrencies are now the de facto currencies on the dark net, and will become the de facto currencies after some time on the superficial net as well. So the quicker the governments start coming up with enabling frameworks,
I sense a debate coming up on that point. I think the jury is still out on some aspects of that. I mean, dark net, yes, but mainstream, there is a debate which is out there. Rajesh, any quick words on that before we end this?
No, I think I agree with Mr. Duggal. And also, I think just the key is obviously the baby steps are important, but making sure that the investors' interests are protected, I think that is something which we will need to sort of look at. But my sense is that banning is obviously not a solution. And crypto is just one part of the game, right? Technology is evolving so fast. Something else will come up in a few days, in a few months and years. My sense is that we look at a baby step, look at what it can solve for, and then sort of reduce the downside of it. And I think that's probably the way to go for on these issues.
All right. Smitaji, any final word on that?
Not really. I think I agree with what earlier speakers have recommended, to be cautious, but at the same time keep up with the technological developments in this critical area.
All right, I'm afraid we are running out of time, so I'm going to have to leave it there. Look, let's face it. Technology in general is continuing to dominate more and more of our lives, and the digital transformation of India, it has huge implications. It has implications for empowerment. It has implications for the transformation of people's lives all the way from the very bottom of the pyramid up. So what the government is doing in these particular areas will be particularly important. And I think from what we've heard from our panel, not everything that the government has to do is necessarily about giving tax relief or tax incentives. There are other things that can also be done which could have a major impact. Thank you all so much for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.